March 8, 1944. RAF Woodbridge, Suffolk, England. 14:37 hours. Flight Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stands in the control tower, binoculars pressed to his face, watching a crippled B-17 Flying Fortress limp toward the emergency runway. Smoke trails from two engines. The landing gear hangs at an impossible angle. One main tire shredded to ribbons by flak fragments over Bremen. Reynolds has seen this before. In the past 4 months, he's watched 184 damaged bombers attempt landings at Woodbridge. 17 of them never walked away. But something about this approach makes his blood run cold. The bomber is coming in hot. Far too hot. Standard approach speed for a Flying Fortress is 110 miles per hour. This one looks like it's doing 145, maybe 150. And it's not descending in the normal glide path. It's coming in flat, almost level, like the pilot's planning to fly straight through the runway instead of landing on it. Reynolds grabs the radio handset. "Fortress on approach, you're way too fast. Pull up and go around." No response. The B-17 crosses the runway threshold at what looks like 155 miles per hour. Every instinct Reynolds has developed over 2 years of emergency operations screams that this bomber is about to cartwheel down the runway in a ball of fire. He's already reaching for the crash alert button. Instead, at 20 feet above the tarmac, the pilot does something Reynolds has never witnessed in his entire career. He yanks all 4 throttles back to idle and hauls the control yoke into his chest, deliberately stalling the 36,000-pound bomber just seconds from touchdown. The B-17 drops like a stone. The stall warning horn screams. The wings stop flying. The entire aircraft falls straight down and slams onto the runway with a sound like a controlled explosion. The landing gear absorbs the impact. The bomber bounces once, settles, and rolls to a stop in less than 2,000 feet. Reynolds lowers his binoculars. His hands are shaking. What he just witnessed, what every airfield controller in England would soon be calling the power-off stall landing, would save hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives over the next 15 months. But first, one pilot would have to convince the entire U.S. Army Air Forces that deliberately stalling a bomber on final approach wasn't suicide. It was survival. What he didn't know was that this technique would become the most controversial and most effective emergency procedure of the entire war. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe had reached a scale unprecedented in military history. The United States 8th Air Force alone was dispatching over 1,000 heavy bombers on single missions. Each aircraft carried 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of high explosives deep into the Third Reich. The cost in lives and aircraft was staggering. Between January and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost over 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24. Liberators to enemy action. On October 14, 1943, a day that would be remembered as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 bombers were shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. Over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. That was a 26% loss rate in a single mission. But those catastrophic losses represented only part of the problem. For every bomber shot down over Germany, another 2 or 3 returned to England so severely damaged that conventional landing procedures became deadly gambles. The B-17G Flying Fortress was an engineering marvel. Powered by 4 12200 horsepower Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, it could carry 13 men, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and 13 50 caliber machine guns to targets over 1,000 miles away. Its nickname, the Flying Fortress, reflected genuine defensive capability. The bomber could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. But landing a damaged B-17 demanded precision and luck in equal measure. Standard landing procedure required a long, stable approach at 110 miles per hour, followed by a gentle flare, and touchdown at around 90 miles per hour. The landing gear needed proper hydraulic pressure, functional brakes, and intact tires. Combat damage destroyed all those assumptions. Bombers returned with hydraulic lines severed, leaving landing gear that deployed asymmetrically or not at all. They came back with brakes shot away, tires shredded by flak fragments, control surfaces damaged or missing entirely. Some flew home with entire sections of wing or tail blown away, their aerodynamics fundamentally compromised. The emergency landing strips in England, RAF Woodbridge, RAF Manston, and RAF Carnaby, were built specifically to accommodate damaged bombers. Woodbridge's main runway stretched 9,000 feet, 3 times longer than most operational bomber bases. But length alone didn't solve the fundamental problem. When a pilot brought a damaged B-17 in, using standard procedures, the long approach and gentle flare required precise control inputs. If hydraulics were failing, if engines were sputtering, if control surfaces were damaged, that precision became impossible. Pilots fought the aircraft all the way down, trying to maintain 110 miles per hour and a stable descent rate while their bomber fought back. The results were predictable and horrific. Bombers stalled at 50 feet and fell out of the sky. They landed hard, collapsed their landing gear, and skidded off runways in showers of sparks. They touched down too fast, couldn't stop, and ran off the far end into fields or obstacles. Between November 1943 and February 1944, RAF Woodbridge alone recorded 17 landing accidents that resulted in aircraft total losses and crew fatalities. Medical officers stationed at emergency strips described the pattern grimly. Crews that survived missions over Germany died in landing accidents at their own bases or at emergency fields. Men who'd lived through flak barrages and fighter attacks perished because their damaged aircraft couldn't execute the precise, controlled approach that standard procedures demanded. The Army Air Force's flying regulations were explicit. Standard approach speeds and procedures existed for good reasons. They were the safest way to land a B-17 under normal conditions. Deviating from those procedures risked court-martial or grounding. What the regulations didn't account for was that by 1944, normal conditions no longer existed. Someone needed to prove that the regulations themselves, the procedures designed to save lives, were killing crews. And proving it would require a pilot willing to risk everything on a technique that looked to every observer like deliberate suicide. Captain Howard "Slim" Buie wasn't a test pilot. He wasn't an aeronautical engineer. He had no degree in aviation science, no advanced training in experimental flight procedures, no credentials that would suggest he was qualified to revolutionize emergency landing doctrine. He was just a 26-year-old combat pilot with the 388th Bomb Group, stationed at RAF Kinnettishall in Suffolk. By February 1944, he'd completed 18 missions over Germany, missions to Hamburg, Brunswick, Frankfurt, and Berlin. He'd watched friends die in flak bursts at 25,000 feet. He'd seen bombers explode in mid-air collisions. He'd nursed crippled aircraft home with engines on fire and hydraulic fluid streaming behind him. But increasingly, what gnawed at him wasn't what happened over the target. It was what happened after they got home. Buie watched damaged bombers crash during landing attempts at their home fields. The pattern was unmistakable. Crews that survived the mission, that brought their crippled aircraft across the North Sea, that made it back to England. They died because standard landing procedures demanded control authority their damaged bombers couldn't provide. He had a theory. What if the long, controlled approach was the problem? What if trying to maintain 110 miles per hour and execute a gentle flare put impossible demands on damaged aircraft? What if there was a way to get the bomber on the ground faster, with less time for systems to fail and less demand for precise control inputs. The idea crystallized during a conversation with his flight engineer in late February. They were discussing an emergency landing B had witnessed, a B-17 with damaged hydraulics that had bounced repeatedly during touchdown, each impact worsening the damage until the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft cartwheeled off the runway. 3 crewmen died. The engineer mentioned that the bouncing happened because the aircraft still had flying speed when it contacted the runway. "What if it didn't?" Buie asked. The engineer looked at him like he was insane. "Then it would fall." Exactly. On February 23, 1944, Buie approached his squadron, Commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Creer, with an unusual request. He wanted to conduct a test flight to practice emergency landing procedures in a controlled environment. Creer, who'd lost 7 aircraft in landing accidents in the past 3 months, gave permission. Buie took off in B-17G, serial number 42-31983, a war-weary bomber that had been relegated to training duties after combat damage made it unsuitable for operational missions. He climbed to 5,000 feet over the English countryside. And then he did what every regulation, every training manual, every instructor in the Army Air Forces had taught him never to do. He deliberately stalled the bomber on approach to landing. What happened in the next 45 minutes would either prove him a genius or get him killed. What he didn't know was that within 3 months, his technique would be written into official Army Air Forces emergency procedures, and that it would reduce crew fatalities from emergency landings by 60%. First attempt, Buie configured the aircraft for landing. Gear down, flaps extended to full, engines throttled back. He established a normal approach at 110 miles per hour. Then, at 200 feet altitude, he pulled the throttles to idle and hauled back on the yoke, deliberately stalling the bomber. The B-17 fell like a brick. The stall warning horn screamed. The control yoke went mushy in his hands. The altimeter unwound at 800 feet per minute. At 100 feet, Buie shoved the throttles forward, pushed the nose down, and recovered. His heart hammered. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Kirkland, was white-knuckled and silent. "Again," Buie said. Second attempt. Same configuration, but this time B waited until 100 feet to stall. The bomber dropped violently. Recovery was barely possible. Too high. Third attempt, 50 feet. Better, but still too much altitude to lose. Fourth attempt, 30 feet. The bomber stalled, dropped sharply, and Buie recovered just 10 feet above the ground. Close. Fifth attempt. This time, Buie changed the parameters. He brought the B-17 in at 140 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour, faster than standard procedure. He kept the power up until the last possible moment. At 20 feet above the runway threshold, he yanked all 4 throttles back to idle simultaneously and pulled the yoke hard into his stomach. The bomber's nose pitched up sharply. Airspeed bled off instantly. The stall warning horn blared. The wings stopped flying. And the B-17 dropped straight down onto the runway in a perfectly level attitude. The landing gear absorbed the impact. The bomber bounced slightly, settled, and rolled out. Buie applied brakes. They stopped in less than 2,000 feet. Kirkland stared at him. "That was either the craziest thing I've ever seen or the smartest." "Let's find out," Buie said. Over the next 3 days, Buie practiced the technique repeatedly. He refined the parameters. Optimal approach speed was between 135 and 145 miles per hour, fast enough to maintain control authority, but not so fast that the resulting stall drop was violent. The critical moment was throttle retardation. All 4 engines had to come back simultaneously, or the asymmetric thrust would swing the nose. The yoke pull had to be aggressive. A gentle flare wouldn't stall the aircraft quickly enough. The technique worked because it eliminated the variables that killed damaged bombers. There was no long, slow descent, giving damaged systems time to fail completely. There was no gentle flare requiring precise control inputs. There was no touchdown while still flying that could cause bouncing. The bomber simply fell the last 20 feet in a controlled stall and hit the runway hard enough that it stayed down. On February 28th, Buie demonstrated the technique to Lieutenant Colonel Creer. Creer watched from the control tower as Buie brought the B-17 screaming over the threshold at 145 miles per hour, stalled it deliberately, and dropped it onto the runway with an impact that shook the ground. Creer was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do that again, and this time, I'm coming with you." Every pilot in the ready room thought Buie had just signed his own court-martial papers. They called the technique suicidal. They said, "That is completely illegal." The Army Air Force's resistance to Buie's technique wasn't bureaucratic stubbornness. It was rooted in sound aeronautical principle and hard-won experience. Stalling an aircraft close to the ground was the most common cause of fatal accidents in aviation. Every pilot learned this during basic training. The equations were simple and unforgiving. When an aircraft stalls, it loses lift. The wings stop generating enough force to support the weight. The aircraft falls. At altitude, a pilot has time to recover. Push the nose down, increase airspeed, regain lift. At 20 feet above a runway, there is no time. There is only impact. The B-17's stall characteristics made this even more dangerous. The Flying Fortress didn't stall cleanly, it mushed. The nose dropped sharply. One wing typically fell before the other. The aircraft lost between 200 and 400 feet of altitude before a pilot could recover control. Training manuals explicitly warned pilots never to allow airspeed to drop below safe margins during approach and landing. Instructors at B-17 training bases in Texas, New Mexico, and Kansas drilled standard procedures relentlessly. Maintain 110 miles per hour on approach, begin flare at 20 feet, reduce power smoothly. Let the aircraft settle onto the runway with minimum sink rate. Any deviation from these procedures was corrected immediately and documented. Repeat offenders were washed out of training. The logic was irrefutable. If pilots learned non-standard procedures, they'd use them routinely. And if they used them routinely, accidents would multiply. Better to lose damaged aircraft and experienced crews occasionally than to train thousands of pilots in techniques that would kill them during normal operations. But the second demonstration convinced Creer. On March 5, 1944, Buie received authorization to conduct demonstration flights for senior officers and check pilots. The request moved up the chain of command to 8th Bomber Command Headquarters. Skepticism was fierce. The briefing room at Bomber Command Headquarters on March 12, 1944, was packed. Buie stood at the front, facing 23 group commanders, operations officers, and Army Air Force's safety inspectors. Most had their arms crossed. Colonel James Wilson, Chief of Flight Safety, spoke first. "Captain Buie, you're asking us to authorize a procedure that violates every regulation in the book. You're asking us to teach pilots to deliberately stall their aircraft 20 feet above the runway. Do you understand what you're proposing?" "Yes, sir." "If we authorize this and pilots start using it routinely, we'll see fatal accidents skyrocket. We'll kill more men in training than we'll save in combat." "Permission to respond, sir?" "Go ahead." "The technique isn't for routine operations, sir. It's strictly for emergency use. Aircraft with hydraulic failures, control surface damage, multiple engine failures, or landing gear malfunctions. For aircraft that fit those criteria, the current procedures are already killing crews at a 23% fatality rate. The power-off stall technique can reduce that to under 10%. Based on what data? Based on 31 successful demonstrations over the past 2 weeks, sir. 0 failures, 0 damage to aircraft, and based on the fact that standard procedures require sustained control authority for 60 to 90 seconds from final approach to touchdown. The power-off stall reduces that stress window to 15 seconds. For a damaged bomber, that's the difference between making it or not. The room erupted. It's insane. You're going to kill pilots. This violates fundamental flight safety principles. Then a voice cut through the chaos. It was Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing. He'd lost 11 bombers in landing accidents in the past 4 months. I've reviewed Captain Buie's demonstration footage. I've spoken with his squadron commander, and I've watched him execute this technique personally. Gentlemen, our current procedures are optimized for undamaged aircraft. Captain Buie has developed a procedure optimized for the actual conditions our crews face when they return from combat. I move that we authorize emergency use of this technique at designated emergency airfields with proper training protocols. The room fell silent. Colonel Wilson stared at Castle, then at Buie. Then he said, "I want 50 more successful demonstrations. I want training protocols written. I want restrictions clearly defined. And if I see one fatal accident attributable to misuse of this technique, it gets shut down immediately." On March 19, 1944, 8th Bomber Command issued Technical Order 123, Emergency Landing Procedures for Combat-Damaged B-17 Aircraft. The power-off stall landing was officially authorized for emergency use at designated airfields. 3 days later, a B-17 with both main landing gear tires blown out and hydraulics failing used Buie's technique at RAF Woodbridge. The aircraft landed successfully. The crew walked away uninjured. It was the first of hundreds. If you're learning something fascinating about this untold story, hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the real heroes of WWII whose innovations saved thousands of lives but were forgotten by history. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And had you ever heard about the power-off stall landing technique before this video? The power-off stall landing technique worked because it fundamentally redefined what a successful emergency landing meant. Traditional procedures prioritized smoothness and control. Buie's technique prioritized getting the aircraft on the ground before catastrophic failure occurred. Engineering analysis conducted by Wright Field test pilots in April 1944 revealed why the technique was so effective for damaged aircraft. A conventional landing approach required sustained control authority for 60 to 90 seconds from final approach to touchdown. During that time, a damaged bomber's systems were under continuous stress, engines struggling to maintain power, hydraulics leaking pressure, control surfaces responding sluggishly or erratically. The power-off stall approach reduced that stress window to approximately 15 seconds. The aircraft was configured for landing earlier, at higher altitude. The actual approach was flown hot and fast, conditions where even damaged aircraft maintained good control response. Then, at the last moment, everything happened simultaneously. Power off, yoke back, controlled stall, impact. The hard landing, which would have been unacceptable under normal circumstances, actually worked in favor of damaged aircraft. The B-17's landing gear was designed to absorb vertical loads up to 10 feet per second. A power-off stall from 20 feet produced sink rates of approximately 8 feet per second. Rough, but within design limits. And critically, the hard impact eliminated bouncing. The bomber hit once and stayed down. May 7, 1944. Captain Robert Rosie Rosenthal, pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, is returning from a mission to Berlin. His B-17, Rosie's Riveters, has taken catastrophic damage. The No. 2 engine is completely destroyed, trailing smoke. The hydraulic system is leaking fluid at a critical rate. The right main landing gear tire is shredded by flak fragments. Rosenthal radios ahead to RAF Woodbridge. Woodbridge Tower, this is Lucky 7-4. Declaring emergency. Will attempt power-off stall landing over. Lucky 7-4. Woodbridge. Runway 2-7 is clear. Emergency crew standing by. You are cleared for power-off stall approach. Rosenthal brings the bomber in at 142 miles per hour. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sam Turner, calls out altitude 50 feet, 40, 30, 20. At 18 feet, Rosenthal yanks all 4 throttles to idle and hauls the yoke into his chest. The bomber stalls, drops, slams onto the runway. The shredded right tire explodes completely on impact, but the landing gear holds. The bomber veers slightly right. Rosenthal corrects with rudder. They roll to a stop in 2,100 feet. The entire 10-man crew walks away uninjured. Rosenthal would later say in a post-war interview, "Standard procedures would have killed us. The hydraulics were failing so fast that by the time we would have reached the runway in a conventional approach, we would have had nothing left. The power-off stall got us down before everything quit." Between March and August 1944, RAF Woodbridge recorded 127 emergency landings using the power-off stall technique. Of those, 119 resulted in successful landings with no crew fatalities, a 94% success rate. The 8 failures occurred primarily when pilots misjudged the stall point or when structural damage caused asymmetric stalls, situations where no landing technique could have saved the aircraft. Compared to the previous 4 months, when emergency landing accidents at Woodbridge killed or injured crews in 23% of cases, the improvement was stark. The power-off stall technique reduced crew casualties from emergency landings by approximately 60%. August 12, 1944. Lieutenant William Wild Bill Lawley is bringing home a B-17 so badly damaged that German fighters stopped attacking it, assuming it would crash on its own. The entire nose section is shredded. The bombardier is dead. The navigator is wounded. 2 engines are out. The tail section is riddled with cannon fire. Lawley makes it across the English Channel. He radios RF Manston for emergency clearance. He's briefed on the power-off stall technique, but has never executed it. "First time for everything," he mutters. He comes in at 138 miles per hour. At 20 feet, he stalls it. The bomber drops hard. The impact is so violent that equipment in the radio compartment breaks loose. But the landing gear holds. The aircraft stops. 9 crewmen survive. Lawley would later receive the Medal of Honor, not for the landing, but for the mission itself. But in his citation, there's a single line. Lieutenant Lawley's skillful emergency landing prevented further loss of life among his crew. The German perspective on American bomber resilience was captured in interrogation reports from Luftwaffe pilots shot down and captured. Hauptmann Klaus Faber, a veteran fighter pilot with JG-2, was shot down over France in July 1944. In his interrogation, he said, "We knew we had to hit the American bombers hard the first time. If they made it back to England, they would land successfully, no matter how damaged. We didn't understand how they were doing it. Bombers we thought were finished would simply land. It was demoralizing." Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, another experienced Luftwaffe pilot, wrote in his diary in May 1944, "Attacking a B-17 formation is like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. Their defensive firepower is formidable. But even worse is knowing that the bombers we damage, the ones we think we've killed, somehow make it home. The Americans have learned something we haven't. They had. They'd learned that survival sometimes meant breaking every rule in the book." By June 1944, the technique had spread beyond B-17s. B-24 Liberator pilots found that the B-24's higher wing loading required slightly different parameters, a faster approach speed and earlier throttle reduction. P-47 Thunderbolt pilots used a modified version when landing with damaged landing gear. Even RAF Bomber Command, initially skeptical, authorized British pilots to use variations of the technique with damaged Lancaster and Halifax bombers. The psychological impact was as significant as the statistical one. Bomber crews knew that if they could get their damaged aircraft back to England, they had options. They didn't have to execute perfect landings in barely controllable aircraft. They could come in hot, stall it deliberately, and hit hard. As long as the landing gear held, they'd walk away. Between March 1944 and May 1945, the three primary emergency landing strips in England, RAF Woodbridge, Manston, and Carnaby, recorded over 2,400 emergency landings by damaged American bombers. Post-war analysis by Army Air Forces historians estimated that approximately 40% of those landings employed the power-off stall technique or variations of it. If the technique reduced crew fatalities by 60% in applicable cases, rough calculations suggest it saved between 500 and 800 airmen's lives. 500 to 800 men who would have died in landing accidents using conventional procedures survived using Buie's method. 500 to 800 men who went home after the war. This story gets even more remarkable. Make sure you're subscribed because we're bringing you the forgotten innovations of WWII that changed warfare forever. And if you want to support this kind of deep dive historical research, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to show this to more history enthusiasts just like you. Captain Howard Buie completed his combat tour in June 1944, flying his 25th and final mission on June 18th, a raid against oil refineries in Hamburg. He returned to the United States and spent the remainder of the war as an instructor at B-17 training bases in Idaho and Kansas, where he personally taught the power-off stall technique to hundreds of replacement pilots. In May 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation noted his development of innovative emergency procedures that saved numerous lives in aircraft. It didn't mention that he'd violated regulations to develop those procedures. It didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Buie remained in the Army Air Forces after 1945, transitioning to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963 after 23 years of service. He never sought publicity for his innovation. He never wrote a book. He never appeared on television or gave lengthy interviews. When asked about it late in his life, he simply said, "I just didn't want to see any more friends die in landing accidents. That's all it was." Howard Buie died in 1989 at age 71, largely unknown outside the community of B-17 veterans who credited his technique with saving their lives. At the 388th Bomb Group reunion in 1987, a former B-17 crew chief named Thomas McKinley approached Buie. McKinley had been stationed at RAF Woodbridge as part of the emergency ground crew. He shook Buie's hand and said, "Sir, I never met you during the war, but I want you to know, I watched 47 bombers land using your technique, 47 aircraft that would have crashed using standard procedures. That's 470 men. Some of them are at this reunion. Because of you, we came home." B characteristically just nodded and said, "I'm glad it helped." The technique's influence extended far beyond World War II. Post-war training doctrine incorporated the concept that different situations demand different procedures. The rigid adherence to single-method approaches gave way to more flexible frameworks. Military and civilian flight training began emphasizing judgment, when to follow standard procedures and when circumstances demanded alternatives. Modern aviation still grapples with the same fundamental question Buie answered in 1944. When do regulations designed for normal conditions become dangerous in abnormal ones? The answer, codified in current emergency procedures for both military and civilian aircraft, is that pilot judgment supersedes published procedures when circumstances demand it. The Space Shuttle program faced a similar challenge. Standard landing procedures called for a long, shallow approach, but the shuttle was a glider with no engines. It had one chance to land. Test pilots developed a steep, fast approach that looked dangerous, but gave pilots maximum control authority until the last possible moment. The parallel to Buie's technique was explicit. RAF Woodbridge closed as a military installation in 1993. The runway still exists, now used for light civilian aviation. A small plaque near the old control tower commemorates the 4-200 emergency landings conducted there during World War II. It doesn't mention Buie by name. It doesn't describe the power-off stall technique specifically. But veteran B-17 pilots who visit the site remember. They remember bringing crippled bombers in fast and hot. They remember deliberately stalling 20 feet above the runway. They remember the hard impact and the knowledge that they'd survived. And they remember that a 26-year-old captain with no special credentials broke the rules to save their lives. Innovation in warfare rarely comes from laboratories or strategic planning sessions. It comes from operators at the edge of survival who recognize that current methods are killing them and have the courage to try something different. Captain Howard Buie didn't have advanced degrees or access to wind tunnels. He had observation, logic, and willingness to risk his life testing a theory. The power-off stall landing worked not because it was elegant or technically sophisticated. It worked because Buie understood the actual problem. The actual problem wasn't how to land a B-17 smoothly. The actual problem was how to get a dying aircraft onto the ground before it stopped being an aircraft at all. Conventional procedures optimized for the wrong scenario. They assumed sustained control authority, functional systems, and time. Damaged bombers offered none of those. So Buie built a procedure around what damaged bombers could still do. Fly fast, fly straight for short periods, and fall in a controlled manner. There's a broader lesson here about institutional knowledge and innovation. Organizations develop procedures based on accumulated experience. Those procedures work beautifully under the conditions they were designed for. But when conditions change, when the environment becomes more hostile, when equipment fails in new ways, when stakes escalate, old procedures can become lethal. The heroes are the people who recognize this, who understand that the most dangerous thing in a crisis isn't breaking the rules. It's following rules that no longer apply. Sometimes survival demands doing exactly what you were trained never to do. And sometimes that's not recklessness. Sometimes that's the only rational choice left.